Chapter 24. April. April dropped the last sheet into the hamper for the day and surveyed the room. She'd have to start the load of laundry tomorrow, but she had enough extra sheets to begin her appointments tomorrow, and she was too tired to stay any longer tonight. No one had told her that fatigue with pregnancy was such an issue. While she could normally be on her feet nearly the entire day without wearing out, the last week had been challenging. She had found herself needing to sit down after every appointment for a few minutes, and one time this week when she'd had a 2-hour window with no clients, she'd actually curled up on the massage bed and fallen asleep. A final cursory glance revealed that everything was in its place to begin the day tomorrow. Thankfully, her first appointment was noon, so she would be able to sleep in a little. She flicked off the light and grabbed her phone from her pocket to call Carter. They'd planned to have dinner together tonight, and she was going to be a few minutes late. He wasn't a stickler for time, but she knew he worried about her now that the sun set so much earlier in the day, and it was fully dark by the time she left at night. She had to admit that she found it endearing. Just another change that chipped away at her ever-shrinking emotional wall. "You're not standing me up, are you?" he asked as his greeting. She chuckled and grabbed her lunch leftovers from the fridge. "Not at all. I'm just running a few minutes behind and wanted to let you know, so that you didn't show up here ready to wage war against dark forces." "I thought you liked me being your knight in shining armor," he said. April did enjoy his concern. She honestly couldn't remember the last time a man had been so protective of her. But she decided to play along and tease him back. "I'm sure I would if you'd done something to earn being a knight in shining armor." "Hey, I cooked dinner for you last night, and the night before. That's knight material in my book." "Uh-huh. I know you think you're being gallant, but for women, a knight in shining armor is a little different. Cooking meals is nice, especially since it was the last thing she wanted to do when she got home in the evenings. But sometimes a girl wants to be swept off her feet." "I guess I better do that now before that belly gets too big," Carter said, the humor evident in his voice even through the phone. April turned the main light off and pulled her keys from her pocket to lock the front door. "Now that is not nice." She forced an indignation she didn't feel into her voice. She knew Carter was only kidding, and honestly, the day would come where she would be hard to lift, or at least awkward to lift. As much as he had to work out for football, she didn't think she would be too heavy. But once her belly grew bigger and her center of gravity was different, she could imagine him having a hard time picking her up. Plus, the fear that he might drop her would probably make it even harder for him. As she turned to press the button on her keys to unlock her car, a shape emerged from the darkness and blocked her path. "Hang up the phone." The man's voice was not instantly familiar, nor was his thick and scratchy voice. But that only intensified the fear that sprouted in her chest, squeezing her lungs and making it hard to breathe. "April, what's going on?" The humor was instantly gone from Carter's voice, replaced with a fearful edge. April paused for only a moment, unsure of what to do. Her first instinct was to do what the man said, to tell Carter nothing was wrong, so perhaps the man would leave her alone. Maybe he just wanted her wallet. She didn't have much, but she would gladly hand it over. But then reality hit, and she realized if this man intended to harm her, following blindly would only give him the ability to do it faster. "Call the cops, Carter." She didn't manage to get the rest of her sentence out because the man surged across the small distance that separated them and pinned her to the wall. The lunch leftovers she'd been holding in her other hand fell to the ground along with her purse. One large hand closed around her throat, while the other held her shoulder to the wall behind her. The smell of alcohol enveloped her, and she could read a look of crazy desperation in his eyes.
"I told you to hang up the phone," he said, grabbing the phone from her hand and throwing it to the ground.
Before he stomped on it, she could hear Carter's frantic voice yelling, "April, what's going on?" She hoped once the line went dead, he would do as she asked and call the police, because if he didn't, April might not make it out of this situation. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and scratchy as she tried to push the words beyond his meaty hand.
"To finish what we started."
What they started? What was he talking about? Though she knew looking at him might get her killed, her eyes studied his face. A vague memory flared within her mind, but she could not place this man. Had he been a client? Had she gone on a less than memorable date with him? She focused on his eyes, hoping they would jog some memory about who this man was. "I think you have me confused with someone else. We haven't started anything. I don't even know who you are."
"You should. You know, I've looked for you nearly every weekend since the day we met, but you haven't been there. Why did you stop coming?"
"Coming?" She blinked, trying to pore through her memory to figure out a place she used to go but hadn't been lately. "You mean my old office? I got a new place, so I moved."
"No, not your old office. The club."
The club? She hadn't been to the club since... And then it hit her, and she knew exactly who this man was. Not his name, as she'd never learned it, but who he was. "You're the guy I danced with a few months ago." Had he been searching for her all this time? She remembered he'd made her uncomfortable that night by holding her too close. But she hadn't thought he was dangerous, just zealous. Now, however, dangerous seemed too mild of a word. She hadn't seen this man in months, hadn't thought about him since the night she'd left the club, but he clearly hadn't done the same. Perhaps unhinged and menacing would be better descriptors, both of which only intensified the feeling of fear pulsing within her. His lips pulled into a smile, but not the normal kind. There was something off about it. It was a little too bright, a little too fake, and it did not seem to reach his eyes. Eyes that were the color of a stormy sea and just as cold.
"See? I knew you would remember. You are not an easy woman to find."
Except that wasn't true since he now had her pinned to the wall. "How did you find me?" Not only did she need to know, but she hoped by keeping him talking that she would give the cops time to arrive. How long did it usually take for police to reach the scene? Her mind slipped back to the last intruder training she'd gone through at college. 5 to 7 minutes was what they'd said then. How many minutes had passed? 1? 2? Though it felt a lot longer, she knew little time had passed. She tried to force even breaths and slow her heart rate, but it was an uphill battle. Her body refused to cooperate.
"I saw you on the television."
April bit the inside of her cheek. She'd always wanted the fame that went with dating a professional football player, but she'd never thought about the other side of it, the darker side of being on camera, of being easier to find, except... But my work was never shown on television. This time his eyes did light up with an almost maniacal glee.
"I followed you from the last game, though your friend kept me from finding your exact house. I knew which street you lived on. Then I just waited till you went to work the next day."
A shiver raced down April's spine. He had waited on her street all night. Clearly he was unstable, as they'd had no interaction beyond that one night. "You followed me?"
"I had to. I had no other way to find you again, and we didn't get to finish our dance."
The air grew harder to inhale as he pressed on her throat, and April pawed at his arm, panic filling her brain. She couldn't pass out. Losing oxygen would be bad for her, but she had no idea what it might do to the baby. "I'm sorry we didn't finish our dance," she gasped. "I'm sorry." His grip loosened slightly, and she inhaled, unsure when she might get another deep breath.
"You should be sorry. You should be sorry you never came back, and you will be sorry that you started seeing someone else."
"Please," April said, debating whether she should tell him the truth. If she mentioned the baby, would that make him back off or send him over the edge? She wasn't sure, but since he already seemed at the edge, she could only hope it would affect him enough that she could run. No doubt he would be faster, but she just needed time for the cops to arrive. "I fell in love with Carter. We're going to have a baby." The words shocked her just as much as they seemed to shock him as he jerked back. She loved Carter? When had that happened? No, not the time. Focus. She needed to focus right now. Focus on getting away, on staying alive. Then she could process her feelings for Carter. April had no idea what this man's mental status was, nor what the issue was that had made him fixate on her. Heck, she didn't even know his name. But she hoped her words would be enough to make him realize she wasn't worth it. She was unattainable. Unfortunately, she guessed wrong. Rage filled his eyes as he regained control.
"No, you can't have his baby. You're supposed to have my baby."
The hand holding her shoulder lifted long enough to strike her face, sending tears to her eyes. Heat and pain throbbed in the space his hand had been seconds before, and the chill in the air only made it worse. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to show weakness, but she couldn't stop the emotions bubbling up. "How could I have your baby? I don't even know your name."
"It's Kevin,"
he growled, and then the hand did let go of her throat, but there was no time to run. Though he let go of her body, it was only so his fists could rain down on her. The first one hit her head, the second her jaw, but it was the third and fourth punch that hit her stomach that scared her the most. The baby. He could harm the baby. Please, God, don't let him hurt the baby. As she thought the words, she realized she could have been praying all this time. Should have been praying. Twisting and curling into a ball in an attempt to keep his hands from her stomach, she let her mind keep uttering the words. For a moment longer, she felt the punches hit her back and her neck, and then the world went black.